Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the Westall UFO sighting. Imagine, if you will, the city of Melbourne in the year 1966. It is a time of transition, where the sleepy edges of the suburbs are beginning to stretch and wake. In the southeastern corner, in a place called Clayton South, the morning of Wednesday, April 6th, dawns with a particular kind of clarity. The air is crisp, carrying the subtle, cooling weight of autumn. It is a day that the locals will later call the Clear Blue Wednesday, a morning where the sky is so vast and unblemished that it feels like a hollowed-out sapphire, stretching infinitely over the low roofs and the dusty roads. In the early hours, the world is quiet. You can hear the distant hum of a few cars, the rhythmic chirping of crickets fading into the heat of the rising sun, and the soft rustle of eucalyptus leaves as a gentle breeze wanders through the paddocks. The smell of wood smoke from a few early kitchen fires lingers in the air, mingling with the scent of damp earth and drying grass. It is an ordinary morning, perfectly preserved in the amber of a suburban routine, where the only thing on anyone's mind is the approaching Easter break and the simple tasks of a Wednesday. Inside the walls of Westall High School, the morning rhythm is well underway. The hallways smell of floor wax and old paper, a scent that is synonymous with the quiet industry of learning. In one classroom, the science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, stands before a chalkboard, the white dust of the chalk coating his fingertips as he writes. The sound of the chalk is a rhythmic click-clack against the slate. The students are hunched over their wooden desks, the surfaces scarred by the pens of those who sat there years before. You can hear the soft scratching of fountain pens on coarse paper and the occasional rustle of a heavy textbook being turned. A single fly buzzes against a window pane, its translucent wings vibrating with a low, monotonous drone. Outside, the sunlight pours across the school oval, turning the blades of grass into tiny spears of gold. The shadows of the goalposts stretch long and thin across the dirt, shifting so slowly they seem frozen. There is a sense of safety here, a profound ordinariness in the way the dust motes dance in the shafts of light that pierce the classroom windows. The teachers speak in low, steady tones, their voices blending into a soft tapestry of instruction that lulls the mind into a state of calm, predictable peace. Then, at approximately 11 o'clock in the morning, the school bell rings. It is a sharp, mechanical sound that shatters the silence of the corridors, vibrating through the floorboards and the very bones of the building. The doors swing open with a heavy, wooden groan, and the stillness is replaced by the sudden, joyful chaos of recess. Hundreds of students, dressed in their gray and navy wool uniforms, spill out onto the yard. The air is filled with the sound of scuffing leather shoes on the asphalt and the high-pitched chorus of laughter and shouting. Some boys head for the oval to kick a football, the leather ball making a dull, satisfying thud as it hits their boots. Others gather near the fences, their voices a low murmur as they share secrets or trade lunches. Near the southern edge of the school grounds lies a wild, untamed area known as the Grange. It is a paddock filled with tall, yellowing grass and a thick stand of pine trees that stand like silent sentinels against the horizon. The scent of pine needles, sharp and resinous, wafts toward the school on the breeze. The students move through this space with the unthinking ease of youth, never imagining that the sky above them is about to change forever. It begins with a single gesture. A student, perhaps distracted by a bird or a shifting cloud, looks up toward the northwest. Their hand rises, a finger pointing into the empty, brilliant blue. Slowly, others follow the gaze. There, suspended in the sky, is something that does not belong to the world of 1966. It is not a bird, and it is certainly not one of the familiar, rumbling propeller planes from the nearby Moorabbin Airport. It is a silver object, gleaming with a light so intense it almost hurts to look at. It is disc-shaped, like two saucers pressed together, with a slight, subtle dome on its top. As it moves, it does not bank or turn like a traditional aircraft. It glides with a liquid smoothness, silent and eerie. It is the size of perhaps 2 family cars, a polished metallic craft that seems to swallow the sunlight and reflect it back in a dazzling, chrome-like shimmer. There are no wings, no tail, and no visible means of propulsion. It simply hangs there, a foreign intruder in the clear blue Wednesday, hovering with a predatory grace above the heads of the growing crowd. The air around the schoolyard seems to thicken with a sudden, breathless tension, as if the world itself has hit a jagged edge and stopped spinning. The shouting of the schoolyard begins to die away, replaced by a heavy, communal silence. 200 pairs of eyes are fixed on the silver disc. Even the teachers have stopped their conversations, stepping out from the staff room and onto the veranda, their faces pale as they squint into the sun. Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher, stands amongst them, his logical mind searching for an explanation that will not come. He watches as the object begins to tilt on its axis, a slow, deliberate movement that reveals its curved underside. It looks like a drop of mercury sliding across a pane of glass. It is so close now that the witnesses can see the texture of its surface, a smooth, grayish silver metal that looks both ancient and impossibly advanced. As it hovers, it begins to descend, moving toward the dark green line of the pine trees at the Grange. The silence of the craft is the most unsettling part. There is no roar of an engine, no whistle of the wind, just a profound, unnatural quiet that makes the hair on the back of the neck stand up. The students stand frozen, their lunch boxes forgotten on the ground, their breath shallow as they witness the impossible manifest in the middle of a mundane Wednesday break. The object continues its low-altitude flight, skimming just above the tops of the trees. Then, from the distance, the sound of engines finally breaks the spell. 5 small, light aircraft, possibly Cessnas, appear in the sky, seemingly in pursuit of the silver disc. They circle it like angry wasps around a silent, metallic predator. The contrast is stark. The planes are loud, vibrating, and clumsy compared to the effortless, silent maneuvers of the unknown object. As the planes draw near, the silver disc makes a sudden, sharp dive, disappearing behind the thick screen of pine trees into the tall grass of the Grange. A collective gasp ripples through the students. Some of the older boys begin to run toward the fence, their feet pounding against the hard earth, their hearts racing with a mixture of terror and exhilarating curiosity. They want to see where it has landed. They want to touch the silver skin of the visitor. Behind them, the teachers are calling for order, their voices edged with a rising panic, but the call of the unknown is too strong. The clear blue Wednesday has been punctured, and as the students reach the edge of the paddock, the shadows of the pine trees stretch out to meet them, hiding whatever now rests in the scorched, flattened grass. The morning routine is gone, replaced by a mystery that will haunt this suburb for decades to come. The sound of the engines belonged to the small, white planes that appeared like frantic birds against the horizon, their mechanical drone growing louder as they banked and turned in a desperate pursuit of the silent intruder. Below them, on the school grounds of Westall High, the world had already fractured into a state of beautiful, terrifying chaos. It was 11 o'clock on that Wednesday morning, the 6th of April, 1966. The sun was high and warm for autumn, casting long, sharp shadows across the gravel where hundreds of small shoes now crunched in a rhythmic, frantic percussion. A tide of children and teachers moved as one, a mass exodus driven by a singular, magnetic curiosity that overrode every rule of the classroom. They were drawn toward the southern boundary of the school, their eyes fixed on the shimmering silver shape that defied every law of the sky they had ever been taught. The air was thick with the scent of dry earth, and a faint, metallic tang that seemed to linger in the wake of the visitor, a sharp, electric smell like ozone lingering after a sudden thunderstorm. As the leading edge of the crowd reached the wire fence, the boundary that separated the orderly, paved world of the school from the wild, unkempt beauty of the Grange. There was no hesitation. The older students scrambled over the top, their heavy woolen blazers catching on the metal barbs, the dark fabric pulling and tearing with a soft, muted protest. Others squeezed through the gaps in the wire, their breath coming in short, excited puffs that felt cold against their flushed faces. Beyond the fence lay the paddock, a vast expanse of yellowed, hip-high grass that rippled like a golden sea under the light breeze. As the students waded into the vegetation, the dry stalks brushed against their legs with a rough, papery sound, 1,000 tiny whispers that filled the space between their heartbeats. Small insects leaped from the grass in startled arcs, and the air was filled with a fine, golden dust that danced in the shafts of light. Above them, the silver object remained suspended, a perfect, polished disk that looked as though it had been turned on a celestial lathe, gleaming with an intensity that made the surrounding blue of the sky seem pale and thin. The craft was roughly 20 or 30 feet in diameter, comparable in size to 2 or 3 large family cars parked side by side. It possessed a quality of stillness that was deeply unsettling, a lack of any visible vibration or exhaust that made it seem more like a collective hallucination than a physical machine. Yet the way it caught the sunlight was undeniably real, reflecting a blinding, white glare that forced the children to shield their eyes with their hands. Some observers noted a distinct dome on its upper half, a smooth, seamless curve that transitioned into a flat, wider base without a single rivet or seam in sight. As it drifted slowly toward a stand of tall pine trees at the far edge of the paddock, the color of the metal seemed to shift. A subtle, ghostly purple hue began to bleed into the silver, shimmering like oil on water, as if the object were reacting to the atmosphere or perhaps to the proximity of the earth itself. The planes, those buzzing, clumsy Cessnas, seemed primitive and frail by comparison, their engine noise a desperate, grinding roar against the elegant, haunting silence of the saucer. The object hovered for a moment above a cluster of dark trees, its presence casting a cold, circular shadow onto the grass below. Then, the descent began. It was not a sudden drop or a fall, but a controlled, graceful lowering, a slow sinking that felt deliberate and heavy. The students watched, frozen in their tracks, as the silver dome began to disappear behind the dark green screen of the pine needles. The silence that followed its movement into the trees was absolute, a thick, pressurized quiet that seemed to weigh upon the field and dampen the sound of the distant plains. The wind, which had been dancing through the grass just moments before, suddenly died away, leaving the air stagnant and expectant. The children began to move forward again, their frantic running replaced by a slow, wary approach, their footsteps hushed by the density of the paddock. They were no longer just curious witnesses. They were pilgrims approaching an altar of the unknown, their hearts drumming against their ribs in a steady, anxious rhythm. Reaching the edge of the trees, the first few students discovered the physical evidence of the visitors' passage. The air here was charged with a lingering heat that radiated from the ground, and the smell of singed grass and sticky pine resin was sharp and cloying. In a wide, circular area approximately 8 or 10 meters across, the tall stalks of the paddock had been transformed. They were no longer reaching toward the sun. Instead, they lay flat against the dark earth, woven into a perfect, swirled pattern as if a giant hand had pressed them down and twisted them in a single, fluid motion. The grass appeared almost boiled or steamed, the vibrant green replaced by a dull, dehydrated brown that felt brittle to the touch. There was no sign of a struggle, no scorched earth or deep craters, only this elegant, concentric bowing of the natural world to the weight of the alien. The object itself flickered through the branches further ahead, a silver ghost retreating into the shadows of the grove, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt as though the world itself had forgotten how to speak. The silver hull, which only moments ago had been a solid, vibrating reality, suddenly defied every law of physics the witnesses had ever understood. It did not bank or turn like the 5 small Cessna airplanes that were desperately trying to keep pace with it. Instead, it tilted, showing its underside like a coin flipped in the air, and then it was gone. It accelerated with a speed so violent it seemed to leave a hole in the atmosphere, a silent vacuum that the warm April air rushed in to fill. The students stood in the long, dry grass of the Grange, their necks craned toward the empty blue, their hearts hammering against their ribs. The hum that had vibrated in their very teeth was replaced by a heavy, expectant silence, broken only by the distant, fading drone of the civilian planes returning to the nearby Murrabin airport. The scent of ozone, sharp and electric like a coming thunderstorm, clung to their skin and their school uniforms, a tangible ghost of the visitor that had just departed. The dry stalks of the paddock, usually so still in the heat of the morning, now swayed with a lingering turbulence, as if the air itself was struggling to settle back into its ordinary patterns. For those standing at the edge of the trees, the world felt suddenly thin, as if the veil of the mundane had been torn and then hastily stitched back together. Before the children could even process the magnitude of what they had seen, the silence of the bushland was shattered by a new, more terrestrial sound. From the direction of the school and the surrounding streets of Clayton South, the wail of sirens began to rise, thin at first, but growing into a jagged, insistent chorus. Within 40 minutes, the peaceful seclusion of the Grange was invaded by a frantic mechanical energy. Dark, heavy trucks and local police vehicles rumbled onto the uneven ground, their tires churning up clouds of fine, red Australian dust that coated the leaves of the nearby eucalyptus trees. Men in the crisp, dark blue uniforms of the Victoria Police spilled out of the cars, their faces set in grim expressions that mirrored the confusion of the teachers. But it was the arrival of the others that truly shifted the atmosphere. Among the local officers were men in the distinct, structured uniforms of the Royal Australian Air Force. Their presence felt heavy and official, bringing with them a cold, clinical efficiency that seemed at odds with the sunny 1966 morning. They did not look at the sky with wonder. They looked at the ground with a calculated, searching intensity. The transition from a site of mystery to a site of military interest was nearly instantaneous. The authorities began to push the lingering students and curious onlookers back toward the school boundaries, their hands outstretched as they formed a human barrier. Ropes and stakes were hammered into the earth with rhythmic, hollow thuds, demarcating a strict cordon around the area where the craft had hovered lowest. The Grange, which had been a playground for local children and a shortcut for students, was suddenly transformed into a forbidden zone. The uniformed men moved with a sense of urgent secrecy, their boots crunching loudly on the dry brush as they established a perimeter. There was no explanation given to the teachers who stood by, their voices lost in the wind as they tried to ask what was happening. The air of the paddock, once filled with the excited chatter of schoolgirls and the shouting of boys, was now dominated by the low, murmuring talk of men with clipboards. The warmth of the autumn sun felt increasingly detached from the cold reality of the barricades being erected. Every movement by the officials was designed to obscure and contain, creating a physical boundary between the witnesses and the physical evidence of their experience. At the center of this cordoned world lay the physical signature of the visitor. In the tall, wild grass, a series of perfectly circular imprints had been pressed into the earth. The largest was approximately 8 meters, or about 26 feet, in diameter. As the sun beat down on the site, the details of the circle became hauntingly clear to those few who managed to catch a glimpse before the area was fully secured. The grass inside the circle was not merely flattened. It was laid down with a bizarre, mathematical precision, swirled in a uniform direction like water caught in a sudden whirlpool. Some witnesses noted that the grass appeared scorched or singed at the edges. The tips of the blades turned a brittle, ashen gray. Others described the vegetation as looking boiled, as if subjected to an intense, invisible heat that had wilted the life out of the stalks without setting them aflame. There were 3 distinct indentations in the soil, suggesting that the craft might have extended some form of landing gear, though no tracks led to or from the site. The smell here was different from the surrounding bush. It was metallic and bitter, a scent that seemed to irritate the back of the throat and linger on the tongue like the taste of a copper penny. As the morning progressed toward noon, the investigation intensified. Men in civilian attire, their suits looking out of place in the rugged paddock, joined the uniformed personnel. They knelt in the dirt, using small brushes and glass vials to collect samples of the soil and the strangely altered grass. Every action was watched by the students from behind the school fences, their eyes wide as they saw their world being methodically dismantled by official hands. The sense of wonder that had united the school was beginning to curd into something else. A growing, uneasy realization that the truth was being gathered and tucked away into pockets and briefcases. Cameras were confiscated from any student or teacher who had dared to bring one to the field, and the black-and-white film was removed and exposed to the light, or simply taken away. The science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, watched from a distance as a senior Air Force officer in a sharp, decorated uniform began to take notes, his face a mask of professional indifference. There was a deliberate effort to minimize the event even as it was being heavily guarded. The official narrative was already beginning to form in the quiet conversations between the men in suits, a narrative that would soon clash violently with the memories of the hundreds who had stood on the oval and seen the impossible. The silver craft had barely vanished into the pale blue of the afternoon sky when the world at Westall High School began to change. The air, once filled with the high-pitched shouts of hundreds of children, grew heavy and strangely thick. It carried a metallic tang, like the scent of ozone after a lightning strike, clinging to the wool of school blazers and the rough bark of the pine trees. Amidst the chaos of the paddock, one female teacher stood with her hands trembling against the cold, mechanical casing of her camera. She had been quick, driven by a professional instinct to document the impossible. Her finger had pressed the shutter repeatedly, capturing the way the sun glinted off the saucer's seamless hull. But as she moved to wind the film for another shot, shadows fell across her. 2 men, dressed in dark, sharp suits that seemed entirely too formal for the dusty Australian scrub, approached her with a quiet, terrifying efficiency. Their shoes were polished to a mirror shine, yet they moved through the long, flattened grass without a sound. They did not ask for the camera. They took it. The leather strap was pulled from her shoulder with a sharp tug. The back of the camera was pried open in the harsh light, the precious film exposed and ruined in a single, heart-wrenching moment of white light. They told her she had seen nothing, and then they watched her until she turned back toward the school buildings, her evidence erased before it could even be developed. Not far from where the camera was seized, a different kind of tragedy was unfolding in the knee-high grass of the Grange. A young girl named Tanya, known to her friends as a vibrant and curious student, had been among the first to reach the fence. In the heat of the moment, she had climbed over, her small frame disappearing into the thicket to get a closer look at the shimmering visitor. When her classmates finally reached the spot where the craft had hovered, they found her lying in the dirt. She was pale, her eyes closed, her body strangely limp as if the very energy had been drained from her marrow. The sight of her sparked a fresh wave of panic. A few teachers rushed to her side, their voices strained and urgent as they called for an ambulance. The sirens eventually arrived, cutting through the heavy silence that had settled over the suburb of Clayton South. The students watched, huddling together in small, frightened groups, as the white van bounced across the uneven ground. They saw Tanya being lifted inside, the heavy rear doors swinging shut with a dull, final thud. As the vehicle pulled away, its blue lights flickering against the green of the trees, None of the children realized that they were watching a part of their own history vanish. Tanya would not be back for afternoon classes. She would not be seen at the school gates the next morning. In fact, for many of them, she would never be seen again. By the time the school bell rang to summon the students back inside, the atmosphere had shifted from wonder to a cold, suffocating dread. The corridors, usually alive with the echoing thud of footsteps and the slamming of lockers, were eerily quiet. In the main assembly hall, the smell of floor wax and old paper seemed more pungent than usual. Hundreds of children sat on the wooden floor, their legs crossed, their eyes fixed on the stage where the principal, a man named Frank Samuel, stood with a grim expression. The light coming through the high windows was filled with dancing dust motes, but the principal's voice was like a hammer, striking down any hope of discussion. He did not ask them what they had seen. He told them what they hadn't seen. He spoke of mass hysteria and weather balloons, his words measured and stern. He warned them that the reputation of the school was at stake, and that anyone caught speaking of flying saucers or silver crafts would face severe punishment. He looked out over the sea of young faces, demanding a silence that felt heavy and artificial. It was an instruction to forget, a command to bury the memory of the morning under the weight of authority. The children looked at one another, their shared secret suddenly becoming a dangerous burden. The suppression did not stop with the students. In the staff room, the pressure was even more direct. Andrew Greenwood, the science teacher who had stood on the oval and watched the craft move with impossible physics, found himself the target of intense scrutiny. He was a man of logic and observation, and he refused to simply look away from the truth. But later that day, he was visited by men who did not belong to the school board. They sat him down in a small, cramped office, the air thick with the smell of their tobacco and the scent of damp wool. They were blunt. They told him that if he continued to speak about what he had seen, if he gave interviews to the local newspapers or shared his observations with his colleagues, his career would be over. They spoke of his future as if it were a fragile piece of glass they were prepared to shatter. The threat was not just to his job, but to his credibility as a man of science. He was told he would be labeled as unstable, as someone who had suffered a breakdown in front of his pupils. It was a calculated, psychological attack designed to ensure that the one adult who could verify the student's claims would remain silent, his mouth locked by the fear of professional ruin. The following day, a student named Jackie, who had been close friends with Tanya, felt a nagging sense of unease that she couldn't shake. She had spent the night thinking of her friend in the hospital, imagining her waking up and wanting to talk about the silver disc. After school, Jackie walked the short distance to Tanya's family home, a modest house she had visited many times before. She expected to find Tanya's mother, a woman who spoke little English but always greeted her with a warm, tired smile. But when Jackie knocked on the door, the person who answered was a stranger. An English-speaking woman stood there, her expression blank and unyielding. When Jackie asked for Tanya, the woman didn't just say she wasn't home. She claimed that no one by that name had ever lived there. Jackie stood on the porch, the afternoon sun hot on the back of her neck, feeling the world tilt on its axis. She pointed to the window, explaining that she had been inside that very house just a week prior, but the woman simply repeated her denial and closed the door. Within 24 hours, an entire family had been erased from the neighborhood. Their furniture, their clothes, their laughter, all gone, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt as though the house itself had been scrubbed clean of their existence. As the week wore on, the physical evidence of the landing also began to vanish. The Grange, once a wild and untamed paddock where children played and explored, was suddenly swarmed by men in uniforms. They didn't just look at the grass, they removed it. Witnesses recalled seeing the circular patches of flattened, graying vegetation being cut out and carted away in the back of military trucks. The soil was turned, the evidence of the heat and the indentations filled in and leveled. By the time the weekend arrived, the paddock looked like any other piece of scrubland, its story buried under fresh dirt. The forbidden photographs were gone, the witnesses were silenced, and the girl who had fainted was a ghost in the memories of her peers. The authorities had moved with a speed that suggested they had a protocol for such things, a well-rehearsed plan for when the sky decided to reveal its secrets. For the people of Westall, the incident of 1966 was no longer a shared wonder, but a secret to be whispered in the shadows, a forbidden truth that would haunt the suburb for decades to come, waiting for a time when it would be safe to remember. The vibrant, chaotic energy of the schoolyard had been replaced by a heavy, manufactured stillness. Inside the brick walls of Westall High School, the air felt thick, as if the very oxygen had been weighed down by the secrets everyone was being forced to swallow. The corridors, usually filled with the rhythmic thrum of scuffing shoes and teenage laughter, now echoed only with the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the industrial clocks that hung above every doorway. In the staff room, the aroma of burnt coffee and old newspapers usually provided a sense of domestic comfort, but today it was sour. The teachers sat in a brittle silence, their eyes avoiding one another as they gripped their ceramic mugs. The headmaster, Frank Sambulb, moved through the halls like a shadow, his presence a silent warning. He had already made it clear that this event was not to be discussed, not in the classrooms, and certainly not with the press. But for one man, the silence was not just a suggestion, it was becoming a prison. Andrew Greenwood, a young science teacher with a mind trained for observation and logic, found himself staring out the window of the laboratory, his fingers tracing the cold, smooth edge of a glass beaker. He could still see it in his mind's eye. The silver-gray disk, a mechanical marvel that defied every law of physics he had ever taught his students. It had been so close, hovering with an impossible, eerie grace, pursued by 5 smaller aircraft that looked like toys in comparison to its sheer, metallic power. Andrew could not simply forget what he had seen. The image was burned into his memory. A craft roughly 2/3 the size of a small plane, shaped like a saucer with a distinct, rounded dome. It had moved with a silent, terrifying fluidity, stopping dead in the air before accelerating at a speed that made the surrounding jets seem sluggish and primitive. He knew what he had witnessed was not a weather balloon, nor was it a trick of the light or a shared hallucination among 200 children. However, the world outside the school was already beginning to reshape the truth. A few days after the sighting, the atmosphere of the school shifted from local confusion to something much more clinical and professional. Men who did not belong in the suburb of Clayton began to appear. They wore dark, charcoal-colored suits that seemed to absorb the light, and their expressions were as stiff and unyielding as the starch in their white collars. They walked the halls with a sense of ownership, their footsteps heavy on the linoleum. Andrew felt their eyes on him even when he was behind closed doors. The pressure was mounting, a slow-boiling tension that culminated in a knock on his own front door late one evening. The sound was sharp and intrusive, cutting through the quiet hum of his living room, where the amber glow of a single lamp fought against the encroaching darkness of the night. When Andrew opened the door, he was met by 2 figures who seemed to have stepped out of a different reality. One was dressed in the crisp, deep blue uniform of the Royal Australian Air Force, his medals catching the faint light of the porch. Beside him stood a man in a dark suit, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. They did not ask to come in. They moved forward with a quiet, practiced authority that compelled Andrew to step back. They sat in his living room, the fabric of his sofa creaking under the weight of their formal attire. The air in the small room suddenly felt thin. The men did not start with questions, they started with a narrative. They spoke in low, measured tones about the dangers of spreading rumors and the importance of national security. They told him, with a chilling lack of emotion, that what he had seen was nothing more than a wayward weather balloon used for meteorological testing. They spoke of light reflections and temperature inversions, using scientific terms as if they were weapons intended to dismantle his own expertise. Andrew tried to protest, his voice steady but his heart racing. He described the 5 planes, the metallic sheen, and the impossible maneuvers. But the man in the suit simply shook his head, his eyes cold and unblinking like polished stones. He told Andrew that he was mistaken, that his eyes had deceived him, and that it would be in his best interest to accept the official explanation without further comment. The conversation then took a darker, more personal turn. The men dropped the facade of helpful correction and replaced it with a direct, calculated threat. They leaned forward, the smell of stale tobacco and wool filling the space between them. If he continued to speak to the newspapers, they warned, the consequences would be severe. They suggested that a young teacher with a promising career should be careful about his reputation. They told him that if he persisted in his story, they would be forced to release a report to the education department, a report that would claim he had been drunk while on duty. They even went so far as to describe the lie they would tell, suggesting they would say he had been seen pouring alcohol into his morning cereal. The cruelty of the accusation was staggering. It was a threat designed to not only end his career, but to strip him of his dignity and his standing in the community. They told him he would never teach in the state of Victoria again. The weight of their words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They weren't just asking for his silence, they were demanding the surrender of his own reality. As they rose to leave, the man in the suit paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. He reminded Andrew one last time that there were no such things as flying saucers, and that the weather balloon explanation was the only truth that would ever exist in the official records. This pattern of intimidation was echoing back at the school as well. In the principal's office, children were being brought in one by one. The familiar, dusty scent of the office, usually a place for minor discipline, had become a site of interrogation. The men in suits sat behind the desk, looming over the small chairs where 13-year-old students sat with trembling hands. They mocked the children, asking them if they truly believed they had seen little green men from Mars, their voices dripping with a condescending sarcasm that made the students feel small and foolish. One teacher, who had managed to snap several photographs of the object as it hovered over the trees, found her camera confiscated before the film could even be developed. She was told the equipment was needed for the investigation, but the camera was never returned, and the images of the silver disc vanished into a void of classified files. The physical evidence of the day was being systematically erased, replaced by a wall of official denial. By the end of the week, the school assembly was a somber affair. The headmaster stood at the lectern, his voice echoing in the rafters as he forbade any further mention of the incident. He spoke of the need to return to normalcy and the dangers of overactive imaginations. But as the students filed out of the hall, their heads bowed and their voices hushed, the memory of the silver object remained, hidden beneath a layer of fear and forced forgetting. Andrew Greenwood watched them go, the threat against his life and livelihood echoing in his mind, a shadow that would follow him for the next 5 decades. The wind in Clayton South has a specific way of moving through the pine trees that border the Grange Reserve. It is a soft, rhythmic hushing sound, like a secret being passed from one needle to the next. Today, if you were to walk through that same stretch of land, you would find a peaceful suburban sanctuary. There are winding walking tracks where the gravel crunches softly underfoot, and a children's playground that stands as a whimsical, silver monument to a day that changed everything. The playground features a large, metallic structure shaped like a flying saucer, with bright red slides spilling out like tongues of flame. Children laugh as they climb over its cool, steel surface, unaware that decades ago, their parents and grandparents stood on this very soil, paralyzed by a sight that science still cannot fully explain. The grass here is thick and green now, but for those who remember April 1966, There is a phantom heat that seems to rise from the earth when the sun hits the clearing just right. The mystery did not vanish when the silver discs blinked out of existence. It simply went underground, burrowing into the hearts of hundreds of children who were told to forget what they had seen. For nearly 30 years, a heavy, artificial silence hung over the Westall community. The students grew up, moved away, and started families of their own, often tucking that morning in April into the darkest corners of their minds. But in 1995, a small ripple began to move through the community. A few former students, now middle-aged with graying hair and a weary kind of courage, began to find one another. They met in quiet living rooms where the steam from ceramic tea mugs drifted into the air, and they spoke in hushed tones about the circles in the grass and the men in the dark suits who had visited their homes. It was a tentative beginning, a slow thawing of a long-frozen narrative. Then, as the 40-year anniversary approached in 2005 and 2006, the ripple became a wave. Researcher Shane Ryan placed an advertisement in the local newspaper, asking for anyone who remembered the event to come forward. He expected a handful of responses. Instead, he was met with a flood. Over 90 witnesses emerged from the shadows of history, gathering at the Westall Tennis Club Hall. The room was thick with the scent of old memories and the electricity of shared truth. People who hadn't seen each other in decades looked into one another's eyes and saw the same lingering wonder, the same unanswered question. They weren't just students anymore. They were the guardians of a shared suburban legend. Among those who returned was Joy Clark. As a second-form student, she had seen not one, but 3 of the silver craft dancing in the sky. Standing back in the paddock decades later, she could still point to the exact spot where the objects had hovered, their surfaces shimmering like mercury under the Australian sun. She remembered the way they moved, not like a plane or a bird, but like a dragonfly trapped in a glass jar, darting with impossible speed before stopping dead in the air. Then there was Terry Peck, who had been just 11 years old. She spoke of the physical sensation that had stayed with her for a lifetime. As she chased the object toward the Grange, she felt a wall of heat radiating from the craft, a dry, buzzing warmth that prickled her skin. She described the sound as a low-frequency hum, a vibration that she felt in her teeth more than she heard in her ears. For Terry, the reunion wasn't just about vindication. It was about the relief of knowing she wasn't alone in her memories. The witnesses spoke of the boiled grass in the paddock, describing how the blades hadn't just been flattened, but seemed to have been cooked from the inside out, turning brittle and white in perfect, concentric circles. Even decades later, some claimed the vegetation in those specific spots grew differently, a persistent scar on the landscape that refused to heal completely. The science teacher, Andrew Greenwood, also eventually broke his silence. His story was perhaps the most chilling, for it involved the weight of official intimidation. He described being visited at his home by men who claimed to be from the government, men who didn't offer names but offered very clear threats. They told him that if he continued to speak about what he saw on the school oval, he would lose his job, and his reputation would be systematically destroyed. For years, he carried that weight, a man of science forced to deny the evidence of his own eyes. The official explanations offered over the years, that it was a rogue weather balloon or a high-altitude HIBAL balloon from the Mildura site, never quite sat right with those who were there. A balloon does not dart like a dragonfly. A balloon does not hover against a strong wind and then vanish in a blink. The documents found in the National Archives years later suggested that a secret radiation monitoring balloon might have been in the area, but the files regarding the specific flight on April 6, 1966, remained tantalizingly incomplete or missing altogether. The silence of the authorities only served to deepen the shadow. If it was merely a balloon, why the threats? Why the men in suits? Why the scrubbing of the school's own records? As the sun sets over the Grange Reserve today, the long shadows of the pine trees stretch across the UFO-themed slides and swings. The paddock is no longer a wild thicket of tall grass and scrub. It is a manicured space, a part of the suburban sprawl of Melbourne. Yet the echoes remain. They are in the stories passed down to children, in the grainy black and white photographs of the era, and in the unwavering conviction of the 300 people who looked up that morning and saw something they weren't supposed to see. The Westall incident sits in the intersection of innocence and mystery, a moment where the mundane reality of a school day was punctured by the inexplicable. We may never know if it was a secret military experiment, a visitor from across the stars, or a collective trick of the light. But for the witnesses, the truth isn't found in a government file or a scientific paper. It is found in the memory of that silver disk, tilting on its axis and reflecting the morning sun before slipping away into the blue, leaving behind a circle of scorched earth and a lifetime of questions. The wind continues to hiss through the pines, carrying the echoes of 1966 into the quiet of the night, a reminder that some mysteries are not meant to be solved, only remembered. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.